On January 14, 1956, more than a decade after Nazi Germany's surrender, thousands of Germans crowded the train platform at Herlshausen on the east-west German border. They weren't there to celebrate an anniversary. They were there to witness something many thought would never happen: the return of the last prisoners of war from the Soviet Union. Among them was a mother who had waited 11 years for this moment. When Chancellor Konrad Adenauer stepped off his own train for Moscow, having negotiated the release of these final 10,000 men, she collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Her son was finally coming home. But here's what makes this moment devastating. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad in February 1943, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Of the more than 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers captured by the Soviets throughout the war, over 350,000 died in captivity. The Wehrmacht, Hitler's armed force, ceased to exist on August 20, 1946, when the Allies formally disbanded it. But what happened to the 18 million men who had served in it? Where did they go? What became of them? This is the untold story of history's largest military demobilization, a process that would determine the fate of millions and shape the future of Germany itself. It's a story of frozen labor camps in Siberia, controversial trials in Nuremberg, and impossible choices that would haunt an entire generation. It's about how defeated soldiers became either war criminals or the foundation of a new democratic military, depending on which side of the Iron Curtain they ended up. Before we understand how the Wehrmacht vanished and what rose from its ashes, we need to go back to the chaotic final days of the war, when millions of German soldiers faced a single, desperate question: to whom should we surrender? May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across the ruins of the Third Reich, German soldiers were making calculations that would determine whether they lived or died. By the time the unconditional surrender took effect, the Wehrmacht had become the largest defeated military force in human history. More than 17 million men had served, at 13 million in the army, 3 million in the Luftwaffe, and 1.5 million in the Navy. But on this spring day, they weren't thinking about those numbers. They were thinking about geography. The dividing line between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union wasn't just a border, it was the difference between probable survival and possible death. German troops in the east were abandoning their positions, commandeering any vehicle that still ran, marching hundreds of miles westward. Officers who had fought the Americans and British for years were now desperately trying to reach their lines before the Soviets caught them. They knew what awaited them in Soviet captivity. The Eastern Front had been a war of annihilation. German forces had killed approximately 8.7 million Soviet soldiers and committed atrocities on a scale that defied comprehension. The Wehrmacht wasn't just Hitler's army, it was complicit in war crimes from Leningrad to the Caucasus. Now, as the tables turned, millions of German soldiers faced the consequences. The Soviets had every reason to be merciless. In the West, the situation was different but far from simple. American, British, and French forces were overwhelmed by the sheer number of surrendering Germans. In April 1945, when Allied forces encircled the Ruhr industrial region, more than 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in what became the largest single capitulation in Western Europe during the entire war. The prisoners came in waves, NCOs leading entire companies with white flags, tank crews climbing out of vehicles that had run out of fuel weeks earlier, Luftwaffe pilots who had no planes left to fly, teenage boys conscripted in the final desperate months, barely old enough to shave, veterans of campaigns stretching back to Poland in 1939. But while the Western Allies generally followed the Geneva Convention for prisoners of war, conditions in the immediate aftermath were nightmarish. Hundreds of thousands of German POs were held in open-air camps with minimal shelter, inadequate food, and overwhelmed medical facilities. The Americans designated these men disarmed enemy forces, a controversial legal distinction that technically exempted them from full Geneva Convention protections during the transition period. Then there was the question of what to do with the SS. The Schutzstaffel, Hitler's elite paramilitary organization, had committed the Holocaust and countless other atrocities. Allied commanders issued orders. SS members were to be separated from regular Wehrmacht soldiers. Tattoos were checked. Blood-type markings under the arm, a distinctive SS practice, became death sentences. Thousands who had served in concentration camps, Einsatzgruppen death squads, and SS combat divisions knew they faced execution or life imprisonment. Some tried to blend in with regular army units. Others went into hiding. Many succeeded, a failure of justice that would haunt the post-war period for decades. Did you know that in the chaos of surrender, entire German units simply dissolved? Soldiers discarded their uniforms, buried their weapons, and walked home pretending to be displaced civilians. In the confusion of millions of refugees flooding across Europe, many succeeded. Some Wehrmacht soldiers were home within weeks, never officially processed as prisoners of war. But for millions of others, the war was far from over. Their captivity was just beginning. The train cars that carried German prisoners eastward into the Soviet Union weren't designed for human transport. Freight wagons, packed with 60 to 70 men each, rolled through Poland and into Russia. There were no seats, no toilets, minimal ventilation. Men stood for days, sometimes weeks, as the trains crawled across the vast distances of Eastern Europe. Some died standing up, their bodies held upright by the press of humanity around them. One survivor, Eberhard Becker, later recalled, "It was a biting cold, where the briefest time outside was enough to give you frostbite. We didn't know if we were being taken somewhere to work or to die." Over 3 million German soldiers ended up in Soviet captivity by the end of the war. The largest group, more than 100,000, came from Stalingrad alone. But these weren't the healthy, well-fed troops who had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. They were starved, frostbitten, diseased. Many wouldn't survive the journey to the camps. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, operated a vast network of prison camps across the USSR. German POS were sent to over 4,000 different locations. Mines in the Urals, logging camps in Siberia, construction sites rebuilding cities the Wehrmacht had destroyed. They worked 12-hour days, often in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Their rations were calculated to the minimum required to keep a laborer alive. According to Soviet records, 381,067 German prisoners of war died in captivity. 356,700 German nationals and another 24,367 from other Axis nations. But historians believe the real number is higher. Many died before being properly registered. Others were executed immediately after capture and never recorded as prisoners. The mortality rate for Stalingrad survivors was apocalyptic. Of the 91,000 men who surrendered with Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus on February 2, 1943, only 6,000 lived to see Germany again. That's a survival rate of less than 7%. Tens of thousands died in the first months, their bodies weakened beyond recovery by the siege. The rest perished slowly over the next decade in camps scattered across the Soviet Empire. Meanwhile, in Western captivity, the situation was drastically different. By 19, the Americans, British, and French had captured over 3.4 million German soldiers. Most were released within 2 years. The Western Allies needed to rebuild Europe and didn't have the resources or the desire to maintain massive POW populations indefinitely. Denazification screenings were conducted, but the process was overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Questionnaires were filled out, background checks were performed, but in the chaos of post-war Germany, many former Nazis slipped through. The Western Allies did, however, use German POW labor for reconstruction, especially in France and Britain. German prisoners cleared minefields, rebuilt infrastructure, worked on farms. In France alone, German POS cleared over 13 million mines. Thousands died in the process. The work was dangerous, and the French had little sympathy for soldiers whose comrades had occupied their country for 4 years. But the critical difference was this: Western posts generally came home. By 1948, most had been repatriated. The Soviets, on the other hand, kept working German prisoners until 1956. Years after the war ended, then came the trials. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg began proceedings in November 1945. 24 major Nazi leaders were indicted for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Among them were Wehrmacht commanders, like Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW Armed Forces High Command, and Alfred Joh, chief of the Operations Staff. Both were found guilty and hanged on October 16, 1946. The Nuremberg trials sent a clear message. Following orders was not a defense. The Wehrmacht's leadership had planned and executed a war of aggression and participated in atrocities. But here's where it gets complicated. The trials also established that the Wehrmacht as an organization was not inherently criminal, unlike the SS, which was designated a criminal organization in its entirety. This distinction would have enormous consequences. 12 subsequent trials followed the main Nuremberg tribunal, prosecuting 177 additional defendants. These included the High Command trial, which put 13 Wehrmacht generals and admirals on trial for war crimes. Convictions were secured, but sentences varied wildly. Some received death penalties that were later commuted. Others served only a few years before being released in the early 1950s. The message was mixed, and many Germans interpreted it as vindication. Their army had been honorable. Only the Nazis were guilty. This was, of course, a dangerous myth. Wehrmacht units participated in atrocities across occupied Europe. They provided logistical support for Eins. They enforced criminal orders like the Commissar Order and the Barbarossa Decree, which suspended legal protections for Soviet civilians and historians now estimate the Wehrmacht was complicit in the deaths of millions of civilians and Soviet prisoners. But in 1940s Germany, few were ready to confront this reality. Did you know that the denazification process designed to remove Nazi influence from German society was largely a failure? In the American zone alone, over 13 million Germans filled out Fragebogen questionnaires designed to identify Nazi party members and collaborators. The bureaucracy was overwhelmed. People lied. records were destroyed. Local denazification panels, staffed by Germans themselves, were often lenient, especially with former soldiers. By 1948, the Western Allies had largely given up on thorough denazification. The Cold War was beginning. West Germany needed to be rebuilt as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. That meant Germany needed a functioning civil service, police force, judiciary and, eventually, a new military, and who had the expertise to staff these institutions, the same men who had run them under the Nazis. This brings us to a moment that shocked the world. October 1950. At Himrod Abbey, in the Eifel region of Western Germany, 5 years after the war's end, 15 former Wehrmacht generals and admirals gathered in this Cistercian monastery. They had been invited by Chancellor Konrad Adenauer himself. Their mission, to draft a plan for rearming West Germany and creating a new military force. The Korean War had just begun. The Cold War was intensifying. The United States wanted West Germany integrated into NATO and capable of defending itself against potential Soviet aggression. But there was a problem. Germany had no army. The men at Himmerod knew this was their chance for rehabilitation. They produced a 40-page document known as the Himmerod Memorandum, the founding blueprint of what would become the Bundeswehr. The memorandum made several controversial demands. First, it insisted that any new German military must be treated as equal partners in NATO, not subordinate occupation forces. Second, and this was explosive, it demanded that former Wehrmacht soldiers convicted of war crimes be released from prison as a precondition for rearmament. The argument was pragmatic. We can't ask Germans to serve in a new army if we're still imprisoning veterans of the old one. Adenauer didn't accept all their demands, but many were implemented. By the mid-1950s, thousands of convicted war criminals were pardoned and released. Some were quietly reintegrated into civilian life. Others were recruited into the new Bundeswehr. This wasn't unique to West Germany. In East Germany, the Soviets created the National Volksarmee, National People's Army, in 1956, and it too recruited former Wehrmacht officers, though always under the supervision of Communist Party commissars. But what happened to the ordinary soldiers? The millions who weren't generals or war criminals, most simply went home and tried to rebuild their lives. Germany in 1945 was a wasteland. Cities lay in ruins. The economy had collapsed. Roughly 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe, flooding into what remained of Germany. Food was scarce. Housing was scarce. Jobs were scarce. For returning Wehrmacht soldiers, reintegration was extraordinarily difficult. Many came home to find their families dead, their homes destroyed, their world unrecognizable. The psychological trauma was immense, but there was no widespread counseling. No PTSD to diagnose, no veterans benefits. Instead, there was silence. German society in the 1950s developed what historians call communicative silence. About the war, people didn't talk about what they had done or seen. Veterans didn't share their experiences. Families didn't ask. The focus was on rebuilding, on moving forward, on forgetting. This silence would last for decades. September 14, 1955, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer stepped off a plane at Linbahn Airport after a historic visit to Moscow. Thousands had gathered to greet him, but they weren't there for the Chancellor. They were there for the promise he brought with him. The last German prisoners of war were finally coming home. Adenauer had negotiated directly with Soviet Premier Nikola Bulganin and Communist Party Secretary Nikita Khrushchev. The deal was straightforward. West Germany would establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. In exchange, Moscow would release the remaining 10,000 German postmen who had been held for more than a decade. When the first trains arrived at Hildeshausen, the scenes were extraordinary. Skeletal men in tattered clothing stepped onto German soil for the first time since the 1940s. Some fell to their knees and kissed the ground. Others wandered dazed, unable to comprehend that their ordeal was finally over. Many had been barely 20 years old when captured. Now they were in their 30s, a decade stolen from them. Families waited with photographs of young soldiers, desperately hoping to recognize husbands, sons, and brothers in the faces of the broken men disembarking the trains. Some reunions were joyful. Many were heartbreaking. Wives had remarried, believing their husbands dead. Children didn't recognize fathers they'd never known. Some returnees discovered their entire families had perished in the bombing or the post-war chaos. The Soviet Union never fully explained why they held these men so long. Official justification claimed they were war criminals undergoing In reality, they were slave labor, kept working until they were no longer useful or until political calculations made their release advantageous. But 1955 wasn't just the year the last post came home. It was also the year West Germany officially rearmed, on November 12, 1955. The 200th birthday of Prussian military reformer Gerhard von Scharnhorst. The Bundeswehr was officially founded. The first 101 volunteers were sworn in at a ceremony in Bonn. Among them were former Wehrmacht officers who had fought in World War II, men who had battled the very allies they would now serve alongside in NATO. The symbolism was deliberate. West Germany wasn't recreating the It was building something newer, so the official narrative claimed. The Bundeswehr would be different, a citizens in uniform army, embedded in democracy, committed to civilian control, educated in the lessons of Nazi tyranny. The reality was more complicated. Of the Bundeswehr's founding officer corps, an estimated 80% were former Wehrmacht members. Many had joined the Nazi Party. Some had commanded units involved in war crimes. The new army's first Inspector General, Adolf Husinger, had served as chief of the operations department of the OKH Army High Command during the war. Working directly under Hitler, critics asked, how could you build a democratic military with the leadership of a totalitarian one? Supporters argued, who else had military experience? The alternative was having no military expertise at all. The debate was fierce, but pragmatism won. The Cold War demanded a functioning West German military, and that meant employing men who knew how to build and run an army, even if their previous service had been to Hitler. Did you know that some Wehrmacht officers served in both World Wars and then in the Bund? Men born around 1900 could have been junior officers in World War I, senior commanders in World War II, and then advisors or trainers in the Bund. 3 German militaries across 5 decades, but not everyone got a second chance. In East Germany, denazification was pursued, more aggressively at least on paper. The Soviets dismantled the old German elite, confiscating property, imprisoning former officers, and executing some, but they also recruited former Wehrmacht officers into the National Volksarmee when it suited their purposes. The difference was ideological. East German veterans had to embrace communism and denounce fascism publicly. The division of Germany meant the division of Wehrmacht veterans. Former comrades who had fought side by side on the Eastern Front now found themselves on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, preparing to fight each other in a potential world war. By 1960, West Germany had built an army of nearly 300,000 soldiers. East Germany had around 175,000. Combined, this meant Germany 15 years after unconditional surrender had 500,000 men under arms again, more than many of the nations that had defeated it. The absurdity wasn't lost on anyone, but in the logic of the Cold War, it made perfect sense. The Allies had decided that the threat of Soviet expansion outweighed the risk of German remilitarization, and so, the Wehrmacht's successors marched again not in conquest, but in defense of the very nations that had destroyed them. The question of justice, however, remained unresolved. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, West Germany conducted additional war crimes trials. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1,965 prosecuted 22 SS officers. The legal system struggled with questions that had no good answers. How do you prosecute men for following orders in a totalitarian state? How do you assign individual guilt for systemic evil? How do you punish crimes when society wants to forget? Many perpetrators were never prosecuted. Some lived quiet lives in post-war Germany, their pasts known but unpunished. Others fled abroad to South America, the Middle East, anywhere they could escape justice. Nazi hunters pursued them for decades, but the vast majority of Wehrmacht soldiers who participated in atrocities were never held accountable. The contrast with the treatment of ordinary veterans was stark. A Wehrmacht private who had simply fought on the Eastern Front and survived Soviet captivity came home to nothing. No pension, no recognition, no support. Meanwhile, some officers who had committed atrocities were reintegrated into the Bundeswehr with rank and pay. The injustice was profound, and it poisoned German society's relationship with its own past. By 1960, 15 years after the war, the fate of the Wehrmacht's millions was largely settled. Of the approximately 3.15 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets, roughly 2.8 million eventually returned home. Over 350,000 died in captivity. The last stragglers came back throughout the 1950s, broken men, forgotten by a society that had moved on. In the West, nearly all Poles were home by 1948. Their reintegration was easier, though hardly painless. They returned to a country divided, occupied, and struggling to find its identity. The Wehrmacht itself had been formally disbanded on August 20, 1946. Its symbols were banned. Its traditions were officially rejected, but the men who had served in it didn't vanish. They became teachers, engineers, civil servants, politicians. Some became policemen. Some became judges. And yes, some became soldiers again in the Bundeswehr. The generation of Wehrmacht veterans rarely spoke of their experiences. German society, in the 1950s and 1960s, focused on the economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, that transformed West Germany into an industrial powerhouse. There was little appetite for reckoning with the past. The dominant narrative was victimhood. Germans had suffered under Allied bombs and Soviet occupation. That it wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that a younger generation began asking uncomfortable questions. Student movements demanded accountability. Historians began documenting the Wehrmacht's role in atrocities. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the regular army had fought honorably while only the SS committed crimes, was systematically dismantled. But by then, most Wehrmacht veterans were old men. Some confessed, some denied, some took their secrets to the grave. The last surviving Wehrmacht veteran, as of this writing, is believed to be over 100 years old. Within a few years, they will all be gone, and with them, the living memory of World War II. The Bundeswehr, meanwhile, evolved into one of NATO's most important military forces. It participated in peacekeeping missions, humanitarian operations, and eventually combat in Afghanistan. It became a professional, democratic institution, very different from the Wehrmacht that preceded it. But the historical connection remains controversial. The Bundeswehr has spent decades trying to define its traditions. Should it honor the courage of German soldiers while condemning the regime they served? Or should it reject the Wehrmacht entirely and build its identity solely on post-war democratic values? These debates continue. In East Germany, the Nationalvolksarmee was disbanded after German reunification in 1990. Its soldiers were either integrated into the expanded Bundeswehr or released. Once again, German military personnel faced the question, which side are we on now? The integration went more smoothly than many expected. By then, the Bundeswehr had 70 years of institutional development. It absorbed the East German military, retrained its officers, and moved forward. Today, you can visit museums across Germany that tell the Wehrmacht's story. The German Tank Museum in Munster, the German Historical Museum in Berlin, the Bundeswehr Military History Museum in Dresden. They don't glorify the Wehrmacht, but they don't ignore it either. They present it as a warning. This is what happens when a military serves tyranny rather than democracy. The Wehrmacht's story teaches us something uncomfortable. Institutions don't simply disappear because we wish them to. 18 million men served in Hitler's armed forces. They couldn't all be imprisoned. They couldn't all be executed. They couldn't all be exiled. They had to go somewhere, do something, rebuild their lives somehow. And so they did, for better and worse. Some became the foundation of a democratic military, proving that people can change even after serving evil. Others escaped justice entirely, a failure that haunts history. Most simply tried to survive in a world that had been shattered and had to be rebuilt from rubble. The fate of the Wehrmacht reminds us that the aftermath of war is often more complicated than the war itself. Victory brings the burden of deciding what to do with the defeated. Justice demands accountability, but pragmatism requires memory insists on truth. But survival sometimes depends on forgetting. Germany made choices after World War II, some wise, some expedient, some deeply flawed. The decision to rearm with former Wehrmacht personnel made strategic sense but moral compromise. The failure to prosecute most perpetrators served social peace but betrayed victims. The silence about the past enabled rebuilding but delayed reckoning. We see the consequences even now. Germany's relationship with its military remains cautious, shaped by the knowledge of what happened the last time German soldiers marched across Europe. The Bundeswehr is constitutionally constrained, culturally scrutinized, politically controversial. Every deployment abroad sparks debate about historical echoes. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps remembering what the Wehrmacht became is the best defense against it ever happening again. The last German POW returned from Soviet captivity in 1956, 11 years after the war ended. He stepped off that train into a Germany that no longer existed, a new country, a new world, a new chance. His generation had destroyed a continent and paid a terrible price. Now, they would spend the rest of their lives trying to build something better from the ruins. Whether they succeeded is a question each generation must answer for itself. When the Wehrmacht was disbanded on August 20, 1946, it took with it the largest military force the world had ever seen destroyed in battle. But the men who served in it, they didn't vanish into history. They became bus drivers and bricklayers, teachers and farmers. The uncles who didn't talk about the war and the grandfathers who died with their secrets. They became, in the end, the people who had to live with what they'd done, and that, perhaps, is the most human story of all.